Private First Class Tony Stein pressed his body against the black volcanic sand and tried to make himself smaller. The morning of June 15, 1944, on the beaches of Saipan in the Mariana Islands, he could hear them coming before he could see them. Not the organized movement of a military advance, but something else. Something that sounded like a human wave breaking against rock, hundreds of voices shouting in unison, boots pounding sand, the distinctive clatter of bayonets fixed to rifles. He was 19 years old, a machine gunner with the 1st Battalion, 23rd Marines, 4th Marine Division, and every instinct trained into him at Camp Pendleton told him to hold his fire. The doctrine was explicit. Machine guns were crew-served weapons requiring fire discipline. You waited for the fire command. You conserved ammunition. You coordinated with adjacent positions. You maintained fields of fire in overlapping patterns. Individual initiative was dangerous. Premature firing revealed your position. Wasting ammunition left you defenseless when you truly needed it. The Browning M1919 medium machine gun beside him held a cloth belt of 250 rounds of 30 caliber ammunition. At a sustained rate of fire, that belt would last perhaps 90 seconds. After that, his assistant gunner would need to reload while Stein provided covering fire with his rifle. But his assistant gunner was dead, killed 20 minutes earlier by Japanese mortar fire that had caught their position during the initial landing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Stein was alone with his gun, with perhaps 3 spare ammunition belts, and with a decision that violated everything the Marine Corps had taught him about machine gun employment. The voices grew louder, through the smoke and dust kicked up by naval bombardment, and, with the continuing artillery exchanges, he could see them now. Not a tactical advance with fire and maneuver, but a human mass moving toward the American lines, with fixed bayonets and rifles held at port arms. Some carried swords, others had bamboo spears. They were shouting Banzai, the traditional Japanese battle cry meaning 10,000 years, invoking the emperor's eternal reign. They were perhaps 200 yards away, moving across open ground toward the hastily established Marine defensive positions. The tactical situation was desperate. The 4th Marine Division had landed less than 3 hours earlier against fierce resistance. The beach was congested with equipment, supplies, and casualties. Medical corpsmen worked frantically to evacuate wounded men back to landing craft. Amphibious tractors were still bringing supplies ashore while taking fire from Japanese positions in the ridgeline overlooking the beaches. The Marines had not yet consolidated their perimeter. Gaps existed between units. Communication lines were not established. Artillery support was minimal because the big guns were still being offloaded from ships. The defensive line was thin, undermanned, and vulnerable. Stein understood the mathematics of his situation with perfect clarity. If the Japanese charge reached the American positions, they would break through. Once through the beach defenses, they would reach the supply dumps, the medical stations, the command posts. They would kill wounded Marines who could not defend themselves. They would destroy the ammunition and equipment that had just been landed. They would throw the entire landing operation into chaos, possibly forcing a withdrawal back to the ships. Everything depended on stopping them here, in the open ground between the ridgeline and the beach. He was one man with one machine gun and approximately 750 rounds of ammunition. The approaching Japanese force numbered at least 300 men, possibly more. The fire discipline doctrine that had been drilled into him demanded he wait for orders, coordinate with adjacent positions, and conserve ammunition. But there were no orders coming. His squad leader was somewhere else on the beach. Radio communication was not functioning. The adjacent positions were too far away to coordinate with effectively. The Japanese were now 150 yards away and closing fast. The Browning M1919 medium machine gun that Private Stein operated was the product of John Moses Browning's genius, refined through decades of military use since the First World War. The weapon weighed 31 pounds without its tripod, 41 pounds with the M1917 tripod mount. It fired the standard 30-06 Springfield cartridge at a cyclic rate of 400 to 600 rounds per minute, though Doctrine called for sustained fire at no more than 150 rounds per minute to prevent barrel overheating. The effective range was approximately 1,500 yards against area targets, somewhat less against point targets requiring precision. Marine Corps machine gun doctrine in 1944 was sophisticated, the product of lessons learned in previous campaigns and refined through extensive training. Machine guns were not individual weapons. They were crew-served weapons requiring at minimum 3 men: the gunner who fired the weapon, the assistant gunner who fed ammunition and helped move the gun, and an ammunition carrier who brought forward the heavy cloth belts of ammunition and provided security. In practice, a well-functioning machine gun section included 4 to 6 men, allowing for casualties and sustained operations. The tactical employment doctrine emphasized careful planning and fire discipline. Machine gunners did not fire at will. They fired on command, coordinating with other weapons in the defensive position to create interlocking fields of fire. The principle was simple but essential. If every machine gun covered the gaps in adjacent positions, no enemy could advance without entering someone's field of fire. Premature firing by one gun could alert the enemy and draw concentrated fire that would destroy the gun position before the main attack even began. Ammunition conservation was drilled into every machine gunner from basic training forward. Each cloth belt of ammunition weighed approximately 7 pounds when loaded with 250 rounds. Carrying sufficient ammunition for sustained operations was physically demanding. Resupply during combat was dangerous and often impossible. A machine gunner who fired wildly at the beginning of an engagement would find himself defenseless when the critical moment arrived. The doctrine therefore emphasized short, controlled bursts, 3 to 5 round bursts for point targets, longer bursts only when engaging massed formations or when final protective fire was called. Final protective fire was the ultimate mission of defensive machine guns. It was a predetermined line across the front of a defensive position, where machine guns would concentrate their fire when the position was in danger of being overrun. The fire command, Final Protective Fire, or simply FPF, meant the situation was desperate. It meant fire without regard to ammunition conservation, without regard to barrel life, without regard to anything except stopping the enemy immediately. It was the last resort, the final gamble, the moment when machine gunners were authorized to fire continuously until either the enemy was stopped or the guns ran out of ammunition. But final protective fire was supposed to come as a fire command from leadership, coordinated across the entire defensive line. It was not supposed to be an individual decision made by a single gunner acting alone. The Marine Corps in 1944 was an institution built on discipline, on following orders, on coordinating actions with the larger tactical plan. Individual initiative was valued in certain contexts, particularly among small unit leaders adapting to unexpected situations. But machine gunners were expected to follow doctrine. The weapon was too important, the ammunition too valuable, and the consequences of premature or uncoordinated fire too severe to leave such decisions to individual judgment. Private Stein had absorbed this doctrine through months of training. He understood the reasons behind it. He knew that firing too early could compromise the defensive position. He knew that wasting ammunition could leave him helpless later. He knew that revealing his position without coordination with adjacent guns could draw concentrated enemy fire. Every instructor at Camp Pendleton had emphasized these points. Every training exercise had reinforced them. Every critique after every field problem had stressed the importance of fire discipline and ammunition conservation. The doctrine was not arbitrary. It was based on hard-won experience from previous wars and earlier Pacific campaigns. At Guadalcanal in 1942, Marine machine gunners had learned the cost of poor fire discipline when Japanese infiltration tactics isolated guns that had revealed their positions prematurely. At Tarawa in 1943, ammunition shortages during the critical first hours ashore had demonstrated the importance of conservation. The doctrine existed because it saved lives and won battles. The Japanese tactical doctrine that Private Stein faced on the morning of June 15, 1944, had its own logic, its own history, and its own psychological foundation. The Banzai charge, properly understood, was not a suicidal gesture of fanaticism. It was a calculated tactical response to specific battlefield conditions, rooted in Japanese military tradition and adapted to the material realities of the Pacific War. The term Banzai itself carried cultural weight that Western observers often misunderstood. It was not a death cry but a celebration of the emperor, an invocation of loyalty to the imperial institution that defined Japanese national identity. Banzai meant 10,000 years, expressing the wish that the emperor's reign would endure for 10,000 years, essentially forever. When Japanese soldiers shouted Banzai while attacking, they were not expressing a desire to die. They were expressing their willingness to risk death in service of something they believed was eternal and worthy of ultimate sacrifice. The tactical roots of the Banzai charge lay in Japanese military doctrine developed during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 and refined through the 1920s and 30s. Japanese military theorists, studying that war had concluded that spirit and aggressive action could overcome material disadvantages. At Port Arthur, at Mukden, at Tsushima, Japanese forces had achieved victories against a larger, industrially stronger opponent through audacity, night attacks, and willingness to accept casualties that Western armies would have found unacceptable. These lessons were codified in Japanese military doctrine as the importance of seishin, or fighting spirit. By 1944, however, the Banzai charge had evolved from a doctrine of aggressive maneuver into something else, a last, desperate gamble by forces that lacked the material means for conventional defense. On Saipan, the Japanese garrison understood their situation clearly. American naval supremacy meant no reinforcements would arrive. American air superiority meant Japanese positions would be bombed and strafed continuously. American artillery would pound defensive positions day and night. American tanks would support infantry advances against fortifications. The material disparity was overwhelming and obvious to every Japanese officer and enlisted man on the island. Faced with certain eventual defeat through attrition, Japanese commanders throughout the Pacific had adopted a strategy of inflicting maximum casualties on American forces before their own inevitable destruction. The Banzai charge, when properly timed and executed, could achieve this goal more effectively than passive defense. A well-coordinated night attack against American positions that were not yet fully consolidated could potentially break through defensive lines, reach rear areas where command posts and supply dumps were located, and create chaos that might delay American operations for days or weeks. The psychological burden of defending against such attacks fell disproportionately on machine gunners like Private Stein. They occupied positions at the critical points in defensive lines, the places where terrain channeled attacking forces, where fields of fire were most advantageous, where a single weapon with sufficient ammunition could theoretically stop dozens or hundreds of attackers. The doctrine placed enormous trust in these young men, most of them teenagers or barely out of their teens, to make split-second decisions under extreme stress while adhering to fire discipline that seemed almost impossibly restrictive. The training at Camp Pendleton had tried to prepare them. Live fire exercises simulated defensive scenarios. Instructors emphasized the importance of remaining calm, of controlling breathing, of selecting targets deliberately rather than firing wildly. They taught the mechanical skills of loading belts, clearing jams, adjusting for range and windage. They drilled the physical movements until they became automatic, traversing the gun left or right, elevating or depressing the barrel, making small corrections without thinking. But no training could fully prepare a 19-year-old for the psychological reality of hundreds of men running toward him while shouting in a foreign language, knowing that his individual decision in the next few seconds would determine whether they died or whether they reached his position and killed him. The training had not prepared him for being alone with that decision, without a squad leader to give the fire command, without an assistant gunner to provide reassurance through simple presence, without any communication with adjacent positions to confirm that his action would coordinate with the larger defensive plan. Private Stein watched them come closer. 100 yards now, close enough to see individual faces, to distinguish officers with swords from enlisted men with rifles, to notice that some of the attackers were wounded already from the naval bombardment, close enough to be certain that if he did not fire soon, they would reach his position before he could effectively engage them. The doctrine demanded he wait for orders. The situation demanded he fire immediately. He made his decision. Private First Class Stein's hands moved with the automaticity that training had built into muscle memory. His right hand gripped the spade grip at the rear of the Browning M1919, his thumb resting on the butterfly trigger. His left hand steadied the barrel, feeling the warmth of metal that had already been fired during earlier skirmishes on the beach. The tripod was properly positioned, legs spread at the correct angle to absorb recoil, the traversing and elevating mechanism allowing him to swing the gun across his assigned sector of fire. The ammunition belt fed from the left side of the weapon, cloth loops holding individual 30-06 cartridges in precise alignment. Each cartridge was a self-contained unit of potential energy, a brass case holding 50-some grains of smokeless powder, a 150-grain boat-tail bullet with a gilding metal jacket, and a primer that would ignite the powder when struck by the firing pin. When the trigger was pressed, the weapon would fire, the barrel would recoil, the bolt would cycle backward, extracting the spent casing and chambering the next round, and the process would repeat, approximately 500 times per minute, until the trigger was released or the ammunition was exhausted. Stein had fired thousands of rounds through weapons like this during training. He knew the sound of proper functioning, the rhythm of sustained fire, the slight variations in recoil that indicated whether the gun was operating correctly. He knew how to clear the typical malfunctions. A failure to feed caused by a bent cartridge or dirty chamber, a failure to extract caused by a broken extractor or weak spring, a runaway gun caused by a worn sear that would continue firing even after the trigger was released. He knew the theoretical maximum effective range of 1,500 yards and the practical reality that hitting individual targets beyond 600 yards required luck as much as skill. What the training had not fully conveyed was the psychological weight of the decision he now faced. The Japanese attackers were 75 yards away, close enough that he could see the expressions on their faces. They were not the faceless enemy of training exercises, not the paper silhouettes on rifle ranges, or the distant figures in orientation films. They were individual human beings, young men not fundamentally different from himself, running toward him with weapons raised and death in their immediate future regardless of what he did. If he fired, he would kill dozens of them in the next minute. If he did not fire, they would reach his position and kill him, then continue into the American rear areas where wounded Marines lay helpless. The doctrine said wait for orders. Reality said there were no orders coming. The doctrine said conserve ammunition. Reality said ammunition was worthless if the position was overrun. The doctrine said coordinate with adjacent positions. Reality said he could not see the adjacent positions through the smoke and could not communicate with them because his radio operator was dead and the field telephone lines had been cut by artillery. The doctrine had been written for ideal conditions, with full crews and functioning communications. The situation he faced was far from ideal. Stein made a calculation that combined training, instinct, and desperate hope. He would fire one sustained burst to stop the immediate threat, then assess whether he had enough ammunition remaining to defend against follow-on attacks. It was a violation of doctrine, but it was the only decision that made tactical sense given the circumstances. His thumb pressed the butterfly trigger. The Browning M1919 fired its first round at 08:57 hours on June 15, 1944. The recoil pushed back against the tripod, the muzzle climb negligible because of proper positioning. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous hammering that drowned out the shouting of the Japanese attackers and even the background noise of naval gunfire and artillery. Spent brass casings ejected from the right side of the weapon, falling in a growing pile beside the gun position. The cloth ammunition belt fed smoothly through the feed mechanism, each cartridge cycling into the chamber and firing and ejecting in a mechanical rhythm that seemed almost independent of human control. Stein traversed the gun slowly from right to left across his sector of fire, the training taking over, his conscious mind observing, while his trained reflexes controlled the weapon. The tracers in the ammunition belt, 1 in every 5 rounds, showed him where his fire was going. Red lines arced across the 75 yards, separating his position from the attacking Japanese, and where those red lines touched, men fell. The effectiveness shocked him even as his hands continued their work. The .30-06 cartridge was a powerful round, designed decades earlier for long-range rifle fire, but equally effective against human targets at close range. The 150-grain bullets travelled at approximately 2,700 feet per second, carrying enormous kinetic energy. When they struck human bodies, they created devastating wounds. Men hit in the torso fell immediately. Men hit in the extremities spun and dropped. The mathematical reality of machine gun fire against massed infantry in the open was brutal and simple. The gun fired faster than men could run, and every bullet that found a target removed one attacker from the assault. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first ammunition belt of 250 rounds lasted approximately 30 seconds. Private Stein fired in a sustained burst that violated every doctrine he had been taught about ammunition conservation, but the tactical reality justified the violation. The Japanese attack was not a probing action or a limited objective assault. It was an all-out effort to break through the American beach defenses before they could be consolidated. Stopping it required immediate, overwhelming firepower, not the carefully measured fire discipline appropriate for a prolonged defensive engagement. When the first belt ran empty, Stein's training took over again. His left hand reached for the spare ammunition belt lying beside the gun position, while his right hand opened the feed cover. The weapon was hot now, heat radiating from the barrel and receiver, but not yet dangerously overheated. He positioned the new belt, closed the feed cover, pulled the charging handle to chamber the first round, and pressed the trigger again. The entire reload process took perhaps 8 seconds. 8 seconds during which the surviving Japanese attackers continued their advance. They were now 50 yards away, close enough that Stein could distinguish individual equipment and weapons. Some carried the standard Arisaka Type 99 rifle with its distinctive dust cover over the bolt and its long bayonet fixed. Others had the shorter Type 44 carbine favoured by cavalry units and special troops. A few carried Type 96 light machine guns, the Japanese equivalent of the American Browning automatic rifle, capable of providing suppressive fire to support the advance. Officers and senior non-commissioned officers carried swords, the symbol of authority in the Japanese military, and, in this context, utterly useless weapons for modern combat. The second ammunition belt fired with the same mechanical efficiency as the first. Stein traversed the gun continuously, engaging the closest threats first, then working outward across his sector. The Japanese advance was faltering now, not from loss of courage or fighting spirit, but from simple mathematics. A Banzai charge required momentum, the psychological and physical pressure of hundreds of men moving together, creating a force that individual defenders could not stop. But when dozens of those men fell in the first few seconds, when the survivors had to climb over bodies and step around wounded comrades while under continuous fire, the momentum died. At 30 yards, the Japanese attack was no longer a coordinated assault, but a collection of individual survivors trying to reach the American position through sheer determination. Some fired their rifles while advancing, though accuracy was impossible while running, and the single-shot Arisaka required manual operation of the bolt between shots. A few threw grenades, the Type 97 hand grenade with its distinctive impact fuse, but the throws fell short, the grenades exploding harmlessly in the sand between the two forces. Stein fired the second belt to exhaustion, then loaded his third and final spare. His water jacket was steaming now, the cooling system that surrounded the barrel converting water into steam as it absorbed heat from sustained firing. The barrel was approaching the temperature where continued firing would risk damage to the weapon, but stopping was not an option. The Japanese were 20 yards away, close enough that small arms fire from individual Marines in adjacent positions was becoming effective. Riflemen who had been pinned down by the initial Japanese advance were now engaging targets. their M1903 Springfield rifles and Monet-Garand rifles adding their fire to Stein's machine gun. The third ammunition belt ran empty with Japanese soldiers 15 yards from Stein's position. He had fired approximately 750 rounds in less than 2 minutes, an expenditure of ammunition that would have earned him severe reprimand in any training exercise. The barrel of his Browning M1919 was dangerously hot, the water in the cooling jacket nearly boiled away, the weapon barely functional and requiring immediate maintenance before it could be fired again safely. But the Japanese attack had been stopped. Bodies lay in rough lines across the 75 yards of open ground between the Japanese starting positions and the American defensive line. The exact number would never be precisely known, but estimates from Marines who walked the area afterward suggested at least 150 Japanese soldiers had been killed in the assault, with perhaps another 50 wounded. The wounded presented their own terrible problem. Many would die from their injuries without medical attention, but providing that attention was impossible in the middle of a battle zone, where Japanese artillery still targeted the American positions. Stein sat behind his gun, hands shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion, and confronted what he had done. He had violated doctrine by firing without orders. He had expended his entire ammunition supply in a single engagement, leaving himself defenseless against follow-on attacks. He had made an individual tactical decision that could have compromised the entire defensive position if he had been wrong about the severity of the threat. By every standard of Marine Corps machine gun doctrine, his actions were questionable at best and potentially subject to disciplinary action, but he had stopped the attack. The Japanese had not broken through. The beach defences remained intact. The wounded Marines in the aid station behind his position were alive because the Japanese had not reached them. The supplies stacked on the beach were still available for the continuing operations. The command post from which officers coordinated the landing was still functioning. His violation of doctrine had achieved the fundamental purpose of defensive operations, stopping the enemy advance. The silence after sustained machine gun fire was not truly silence, but rather a different soundscape that seemed quiet by comparison. Private Stein could hear the continuing naval bombardment from ships offshore, the crack of artillery rounds impacting on Japanese positions in the ridgeline, the small arms fire from other sectors of the beach where fighting continued, and underneath it all, the sounds of wounded men calling for corpsmen. His ears rang from the sustained firing, a high-pitched tone that would persist for hours and become a permanent feature of his hearing for the rest of his life. Ammunition resupply arrived 20 minutes after the attack was repulsed, carried forward by Marines from the beach supply dumps, who crawled and ran through continuing artillery fire to bring machine gun ammunition to the defensive positions. They brought 6 more cloth belts of 30-06 ammunition, each belt containing 250 rounds, enough to sustain defensive operations through the rest of the day if fired with proper discipline. They brought water for the gun's cooling jacket, 5-gallon cans sloshing as they were dragged across the sand. They brought word that similar attacks had hit other sectors of the beach perimeter and had been repulsed everywhere, though casualties among the defenders had been significant. A lieutenant from the battalion staff arrived to assess the situation. He examined Stein's position, looked at the piles of spent brass casings, counted the empty ammunition belts, and studied the field of fire where Japanese bodies lay in rough lines marking the advance of the attack. He asked Stein a series of questions. When had the attack begun? How many attackers had there been? Had Stein received the order for final protective fire? Why had he fired without coordination with adjacent positions? Did he understand that he had violated fire discipline doctrine? Stein answered truthfully. He had not received orders because his squad leader was elsewhere and communications were not functioning. He had fired because the Japanese were going to overrun his position if he had not. He understood that he had violated doctrine, but believed the tactical situation justified the violation. He had approximately 3 spare ammunition belts at the beginning of the engagement and had fired all of them, plus his initial belt in stopping the attack. His assistant gunner was dead, killed earlier by mortar fire, leaving him to operate the weapon alone. The lieutenant considered this information, then made a decision that reflected the practical realities of combat versus the theoretical ideals of doctrine. Stein had acted appropriately given the circumstances. His violation of fire discipline doctrine was justified by the tactical emergency. His expenditure of ammunition had achieved its purpose. His individual initiative had prevented a breakthrough that could have compromised the entire beach defences. Rather than face disciplinary action, Stein would be recommended for recognition of his actions, though the specific award would be determined by higher headquarters after review of the engagement. The conversation revealed the tension inherent in military doctrine between standardized procedures that worked in most situations and individual initiative required in exceptional circumstances. Doctrine existed because following proven procedures usually produced better outcomes than improvisation. Machine gun fire discipline and ammunition conservation were sound principles backed by decades of experience. But doctrine could not account for every possible situation. When communications failed, when crew members were killed, when the tactical situation deviated significantly from planning assumptions, individual Marines had to make decisions based on their training, their understanding of the tactical situation, and their judgment about what would best accomplish the mission. Stein's decision to fire without orders represented the successful application of this principle. He had understood both the doctrine and the reasons behind it. He had recognized that the specific circumstances of his situation justified deviation from standard procedures. He had accepted the risk of disciplinary action in favor of accomplishing the tactical objective. These were the hallmarks of effective small unit leadership, even though Stein was an enlisted man without formal leadership position. The psychological burden of his actions would not become fully apparent until later, after the adrenaline faded and the immediate tactical situation stabilized. Stein had killed at least several dozen men, and possibly many more, in approximately 2 minutes of sustained fire. The exact number was unknowable because machine gun fire into massed formations made it impossible to attribute individual casualties to specific shooters, but the mathematical reality of 750 rounds fired at close range against targets in the open meant that a substantial percentage of his bullets had found human targets. The training at Camp Pendleton had prepared him for the mechanical tasks of operating the weapon, but had not fully prepared him for the psychological reality of killing at scale. Rifle marksmanship training taught Marines to engage individual targets, one shot at a time, with clear attribution of each kill to the individual shooter. Machine gun training emphasized the weapon as an area denial tool, firing at grid coordinates or terrain features rather than at individual human beings. The psychological distance created by this training helped Marines perform their duties without being overwhelmed by the moral weight of taking human life. But at point-blank range against massed formations, that psychological distance collapsed. Stein had seen the faces of the men he killed. He had watched them fall, watched them try to continue advancing while wounded, watched the attack disintegrate under his fire. The memory would remain vivid for the rest of his life, not as trauma in the clinical sense, but as a defining moment that separated his understanding of himself before combat from his understanding of himself after. The battle for Saipan continued for 3 weeks after the Japanese Banzai charge on June 15, 1944. Private First Class Tony Stein remained in action. Throughout the campaign, operating his Browning M1919 machine gun in defensive positions, and supporting offensive operations as the 4th Marine Division fought its way across the island. He participated in the assault on Mount Tapochau, the volcanic peak that dominated the island's interior and served as the anchor of Japanese defensive positions. He provided covering fire during the attacks on Death Valley and Purple Heart Ridge, terrain features that acquired their names from the casualties sustained in taking them. His actions on the first day of the invasion were documented in after-action reports compiled by battalion and regimental staff officers. These reports noted the effective defensive fire that stopped Japanese counterattacks against the beach positions, and specifically mentioned individual machine gunners whose actions had been critical in maintaining the perimeter. Stein's name appeared in these reports, along with descriptions of the tactical situation that he had faced and the decisions he had made under fire. The recommendation for recognition moved through the military awards system with the bureaucratic slowness characteristic of such processes. Officers at battalion level endorsed the recommendation and forwarded it to regimental headquarters. Regimental staff reviewed the documentation, compared it to criteria for various awards, and made their own recommendation to division headquarters. Division staff conducted their review, considering not only the specific actions but also the broader context of the Saipan campaign and the precedent that any award would set for future cases. The question facing the awards reviewers was not whether Stein's actions had been effective or necessary. The tactical outcome demonstrated clearly that his decision to fire without orders had been correct given the circumstances. The question was whether those actions merited formal recognition beyond the acknowledgement that he had performed his duties effectively. Thousands of Marines on Saipan had performed their duties effectively. Many had shown individual initiative in difficult situations. The award system could not recognize every instance of competent performance without diluting the meaning of military decorations. The criteria that ultimately determined the level of recognition focused on several factors. First, the severity of the tactical situation. Stein had faced an overwhelming enemy force while isolated from his chain of command and without crew members to assist in operating the weapon. Second, the significance of the outcome. His actions had prevented a breakthrough that could have compromised the entire beach defense. Third, the degree of risk. He had deliberately violated Doctrine and accepted the possibility of disciplinary action in favor of accomplishing the mission. Fourth, the scale of impact. His fire had stopped an attack by several hundred enemy soldiers, inflicting substantial casualties and disrupting Japanese operational plans. Based on these factors, Division Headquarters approved the award of the Silver Star Medal, the third highest decoration for valor in the United States military. The citation, accompanying the award, described Stein's actions in formal language that emphasized the tactical situation, the decisions he made, and the outcome of the engagement. It noted his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy, and his initiative and sound tactical judgment in the face of overwhelming enemy assault. The medal itself was presented in a ceremony conducted several weeks after the battle, after Saipan had been secured and the 4th Marine Division had time to reorganize and absorb replacements for casualties. Stein stood in formation with other Marines being recognized for their actions during the campaign, while a colonel read the citations and pinned medals on uniform jackets. The ceremony lasted perhaps 30 minutes, a brief formal acknowledgement of actions that had taken place in circumstances far removed from the parade ground formality of the awards presentation. For Stein, the recognition was meaningful but also somewhat disconnected from his memory of the event. The citation described his actions in heroic terms, emphasizing courage and tactical judgment. His own memory of the event centered on different aspects: the isolation and uncertainty of the moment, the violation of doctrine he had been taught to follow, the weight of the decision to fire, and the faces of the men who had died under his gun. The official narrative of heroism and the personal experience of combat existed in parallel, but did not fully align. The broader significance of Stein's actions lay not in their uniqueness, but in their typicality. Throughout the Pacific War, young Marines in similar situations made similar decisions, balancing doctrine against tactical reality, following training while adapting to circumstances that training had not fully anticipated. The success of American forces in the Pacific depended not only on material superiority and sound operational planning, but also on the ability of individual Marines to exercise judgment at the tactical level when communications failed, when leaders were killed, when the situation deviated from planning assumptions. The after-action reports from Saipan that documented Private Stein's actions and similar incidents throughout the campaign became part of the institutional learning process that continuously refined Marine Corps doctrine during World War II. Staff officers at division and corps level analyzed these reports, looking for patterns that suggested doctrinal deficiencies or areas where training could be improved. The pattern they identified regarding machine gun employment was clear. Doctrine written for ideal conditions with full crews and functioning communications often required adaptation when those conditions did not exist. The specific issue was fire, discipline versus individual initiative. Machine gun doctrine emphasized coordinated fire and ammunition conservation for sound tactical reasons that remained valid in most situations. But when individual gunners found themselves isolated from command and control, facing immediate threats that required instant response, strict adherence to fire discipline could result in tactical failure. The challenge was developing doctrine that preserved the benefits of coordination and conservation while allowing appropriate flexibility for exceptional circumstances. The solution developed in revised training materials and doctrinal publications issued in late 1944 and early 1945 was not to abandon fire discipline, but to provide clearer guidance on when deviation was justified. Machine gunners were taught explicit criteria for making decisions in the absence of orders. If communications were not functioning and no orders could be received, the gunner had authority to engage immediate threats. If the position was in danger of being overrun and no support was available, the gunner could fire final protective fire on his own initiative. If crew members were casualties and the tactical situation required immediate action, the gunner could operate the weapon alone. These modifications to doctrine acknowledged the reality that combat rarely conformed to planning assumptions. Communications equipment failed. Leaders were killed or wounded. Positions became isolated. In these circumstances, the Marine Corps needed individual Marines who understood both the standard procedures and the principles behind them well enough to adapt appropriately. The goal was not to replace disciplined following of doctrine with unlimited individual discretion, but to develop Marines who could exercise informed judgment about when deviation from standard procedures was necessary. The training implications of this refined doctrine were significant. Machine gun training at Camp Pendleton and other Marine Corps bases began including more scenarios where students had to make decisions without explicit orders. Instructors created training problems where communications failed, where assistant gunners became casualties, where the tactical situation required immediate response before coordination with adjacent positions was possible. The goal was to develop the judgment required to distinguish between situations where doctrine should be followed strictly and situations where adaptation was necessary. This emphasis on tactical judgment at the lowest levels was characteristic of Marine Corps institutional culture and distinguished American military practice from that of many other nations during World War II. German military doctrine also emphasized individual initiative, particularly among officers and non-commissioned officers, but within a more rigid hierarchical structure. Japanese military doctrine placed enormous emphasis on obedience to orders and following established procedures, with individual initiative valued primarily in offensive operations rather than defensive situations. Soviet doctrine stressed centralized control and coordination, with individual decisions by junior personnel often viewed as dangerous deviation. The American approach, particularly in the Marine Corps, accepted the risks of individual decision-making in favor of tactical flexibility. This approach worked because it was paired with extensive training that developed both technical competence and judgment. Marines learned not only how to operate weapons, but also when and why to use them. They learned not only standard procedures, but also the principles that made those procedures effective. They developed the ability to analyze tactical situations, recognize when standard procedures were appropriate, and adapt when circumstances required. The success of this approach was visible throughout the Pacific Campaign. On Peleliu in September 1944, on Iwo Jima in February 1945, on Okinawa in April through June 1945, individual Marines repeatedly made tactical decisions that deviated from strict doctrine but achieved mission objectives. Machine gunners fired without orders when they identified immediate threats. Squad leaders maneuvered their units without waiting for explicit instructions when they saw opportunities. Platoon commanders adapted plans when the tactical situation changed. This flexibility, combined with technical competence and sound judgment developed through training, gave American forces significant advantages in the fluid, chaotic environment of island warfare. The institutional learning process that incorporated lessons from Saipan and other campaigns continued throughout the war and into the post-war period. The Marine Corps systematically collected after-action reports, analyzed combat experiences, and modified doctrine and training based on what worked and what did not. This process was not perfect, and many valuable lessons were learned too slowly or applied inconsistently, but it represented a genuine commitment to institutional improvement based on empirical evidence rather than preconceived assumptions. Private Stein's individual experience on the morning of June 15, 1944, was one data point in this larger process. His decision to fire without orders, his expenditure of ammunition in stopping the Japanese attack, and the successful outcome of his actions provided evidence that supported doctrinal modifications, allowing greater individual initiative in specific circumstances. The Silver Star Medal he received was recognition not only of his courage, but also of his sound tactical judgment, his ability to analyze a situation under extreme stress and make decisions that accomplished the mission even when those decisions violated standard procedures. Tony Stein survived the Battle of Saipan, the campaign that tested every aspect of Marine Corps training and doctrine in the crucible of sustained combat against a determined enemy fighting on terrain they had fortified for months. He survived the weeks of fighting through the island's interior, the assaults on fortified positions, the constant artillery and mortar fire, the heat and exhaustion and psychological strain of continuous operations. He returned to Hawaii with the 4th Marine Division after the island was secured in early July 1944, and he participated in the training and reorganization that prepared the division for its next operation. That next operation was Iwo Jima, the small volcanic island less than 8 square miles in area that would consume American and Japanese lives in proportions that shocked even veterans of previous Pacific campaigns. The 4th Marine Division landed on the eastern beaches of Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945. As part of a 3-division assault against Japanese defenses that had been prepared with unusual thoroughness. Tony Stein went ashore in the initial assault waves, carrying not his Browning M1919 machine gun, but a weapon he had fabricated himself from the wing-mounted machine gun of a destroyed aircraft, a 6-barreled weapon he called his Stinger, that provided devastating firepower at close range. On the first day of the Iwo Jima invasion, Corporal Tony Stein, promoted since Saipan, repeatedly charged Japanese pillboxes and fortified positions, using his improvised weapon to suppress enemy fire, while other Marines maneuvered to destroy the positions with demolitions and flamethrowers. He made multiple trips back to the beach to obtain ammunition and to evacuate wounded Marines, exposing himself to enemy fire each time. His actions that day were extraordinary, even by the standards of Marine Corps combat operations, displaying courage and initiative that exceeded anything expected of individual Marines. On March 1, 1945, 10 days into the battle for Iwo Jima, Tony Stein was killed in action. The specific circumstances of his death were not recorded in detail, lost in the chaos of combat operations where thousands of Marines were engaged simultaneously across the small island. He was 20 years old. His body was recovered and buried temporarily in the 5th Marine Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima, then later reinterred in the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, Hawaii. The recommendation for recognition of his actions on the first day of the Iwo Jima invasion moved through the awards system with the same bureaucratic process that had reviewed his Saipan actions. But the scale and significance of what he had accomplished on February 19, 1945, exceeded the criteria for any award except the highest. On June 27, 1945, President Harry Truman presented the Medal of Honor posthumously to Tony Stein's widow at a ceremony in Washington. The citation described actions that went far beyond the tactical judgment and fire discipline that had characterized his performance at Saipan, actions that represented the extreme limit of courage and self-sacrifice. The trajectory from private first class, making a doctrine-violating decision on a Saipan beach, to corporal dying in combat on Iwo Jima after actions that earned the nation's highest military decoration spanned 9 months and encompassed the transformation of a competent Marine into an exceptional warrior. But the essential character that enabled both sets of actions was consistent. The ability to analyze tactical situations under extreme stress, to make sound decisions despite uncertainty and fear, to accept personal risk in accomplishing the mission, and to place mission accomplishment and the welfare of fellow Marines above personal safety and adherence to bureaucratic procedures. The story of Tony Stein's decision to fire without orders on June 15, 1944, is significant not because it was unique, but because it was representative. Throughout the Pacific War, thousands of young Marines faced similar moments of decision, situations where doctrine and reality diverged, where following orders strictly might result in tactical failure, where individual judgment had to substitute for coordination and planning. Most of these decisions were never documented in after-action reports or recognized with formal awards. They were simply part of the continuous flow of tactical adaptation that characterized combat operations. The institutional significance of these collective individual decisions was profound. They demonstrated that the Marine Corps had succeeded in developing not just technically competent Marines who could operate weapons and follow procedures, but thinking Marines who understood the principles behind the procedures well enough to adapt appropriately. This capability was not the result of lowering standards or accepting poor discipline. It was the result of intensive training that developed both skills and judgment, of doctrine that provided clear guidance while allowing appropriate flexibility, and of leadership that trusted junior Marines to make decisions at the tactical level. The personal significance for the individuals who made these decisions varied. Some, like Tony Stein, went on to further acts of heroism and were recognized accordingly. Others served their time in combat, made their decisions, accomplished their missions, and returned home to civilian life without formal recognition beyond the standard campaign medals awarded to all participants. The absence of medals did not diminish what they had accomplished or the burden they carried. The psychological burden of combat, particularly for machine gunners who killed at scale rather than in individual engagements, was substantial and lifelong. The memory of faces seen through gun sights, of bodies falling under sustained fire, of the mechanical process of killing dozens of human beings in minutes, could not be fully processed or reconciled with peacetime morality. Most veterans did not speak of these experiences except with other veterans who shared the context and would not judge. The broader society that benefited from their actions often preferred not to hear the specific details of how those actions were accomplished. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe